When you take damage in Rainbow Six Siege, your screen looks like this. However, there is now a new setting to make it look like this. Hey guys, it's Cord Ross and Rainbow Six News. Today we're testing out a brand new setting in Rainbow Six Siege that you should switch off. And this is a setting that is coming with the new season Twin Shells. Now the setting itself is a very surprising one because I did not think Rainbow Six Siege actually had this feature. And it is simply motion blur, which I switch off in every game where there is that setting. And this is the first time it's been added to Rainbow Six Siege. And as it says in the description here, tons motion blur for movement and damage on or off, helpful for players with visible impairment or experience motion sickness, and it is in the accessibility settings. That means it's a setting available on both PC and console. Now normally I would associate motion blur with moving very rapidly around with the screen. You'll notice that if we freeze frame in the middle of motion in Rainbow Six Siege, even with the motion blur on, there is no motion blur. And of course if we switch it off, it looks exactly the same. So where is this motion blur being used in Rainbow Six Siege and why should you switch it off? And the first one we'll look at is taking damage. So when you're taking damage in Rainbow Six Siege, you will get this effect that kind of pulls back on the screen, giving you a flinch-like effect that gives you a good understanding that you are taking damage. Now before this season, I would not have called this motion blur. I would have assumed it was some sort of other effect. But as you can see, it is pretty significant, even when aiming down your scope. So if we go in and we switch motion blur off, you'll notice that boom, all of a sudden, it's gone. And it gives you the sense that the screen is no longer shaking and no longer flinching, and you can see way clearer. Now there is a downside. You'll notice that there's a big red impact all around your screen with lots of blood. A lot of people have been complaining that this is a terrible new effect being added to the game. However, this effect is actually unchanged, and it's because of the motion blur and the way it pulls back on the screen that it pushes most of that red off the screen, resulting in it not being as visible. So this is the downside of switching motion blur off. Now let's pause on those freeze frames so you can see how different it is between the motion blur on and off. I think there is pretty much no reason to switch the motion blur on. You should always have it off now. And perhaps you don't like the red, and maybe even during the test server phase they will tweak this, but to me it is actually far better than having the motion blur on, just for the increased awareness and visibility. Now let's move on to movement and how the motion blur affects that, and also how one operator here gets a significant buff from this setting. So first off, default movement has no motion blur in Rainbow Six Siege. And again, I was surprised that there was a motion blur setting coming, because I was like, there is no motion blur in the sense that I think of it.
We could be here all day, literally.
However, there is one operator who does get motion blur when he is moving, and that is Oryx. And of course, he also takes damage when he goes through a wall, so he gets even more motion blur. So by switching off the motion blur setting, we get a clear picture, which I think significantly buffs his ability to see targets once he's busting through a wall or just simply doing his dash. And that is an issue I've had with Oryx. And if we look at these side-by-side comparisons, you can see how much more visibility we get. And I will note that when you go through a wall, you do get a doubling of vision still. So I assume obviously that is not a blur effect and it's some sort of other effect. But I would say that the visibility is a lot better without the motion blur. So the conclusion to this video is very simple. I think you should switch motion blur off when Operation Twin Shells launches, and that is the first thing I will be doing when the new season comes out. I'm going to switch motion blur off. To me, the negative side effects of the increased red on the edge of the screen is less impactful than the motion blur, which can actually make it all the way to the center of the screen. So yeah, my recommendation right now is to switch motion blur off. Anyway guys, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and found it useful, leave a comment below and of course like the video. And a big thank you to my Patreons and channel members because you guys keep the lights on. Anyway guys, thanks for watching and I'll catch you next time.